Hello, Comics Alternative fans. Before we start with the episode, we want to invite all of you to check out our Patreon campaign.
That's right. Go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative for more details. There you'll find more information about the campaign and the cool rewards levels we have.
For as little as $1 a month, you can help us maintain good quality comics talk, and the more you contribute, the more perks you get.
These include monthly podcast episodes exclusive to Patreon supporters, as well as the chance to help us choose which books we review on the show. So be sure to visit www.patreon.com/comicsalternative and become one of our proud podcast patrons.
Yeah, and now on with the show.
This is the Comics Alternative for young readers. Reviews of Monster and Hereville, How Mirka Caught a Fish.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative for Young Readers. I'm Andy.
And I'm Gwen, and we're two PhDs talking about comics for young people.
And on this episode of the Comics Alternative for Young Readers, we're going to take a look at two books. Monster by Walter Dean Myers, Guy A. Sims, and Dawood Ayaburue. I think I messed that up, Gwen.
It's close. You're okay. Close.
And also Hereville, How Mirka Caught a Fish by Barry Deutsch. But since this is the third book in the Hereville series, we're actually going to be talking about all three of those books, Gwen, so I'm really excited about that.
Absolutely. And also we have a special thing that we're doing this time, don't we, Andy?
We do. We're going to mention a few more books on today's show. You know, Gwen and I have been talking about how much fun it is to discuss one teen book and one book for younger readers on the show each month. But, you know, that really only scratches the surface of all the great graphic novels that come out every month. And, you know, we just don't have time to talk about all of them. But, you know, we kind of thought that just talking about two just wouldn't be enough. So what we're going to do is talk about a few other books, and just because we're not talking about these other books as fully as we do the two main books doesn't mean that they're of lesser quality. We just don't have the time to go into detail with all of those books. But we do want to make sure that you know about them because we think you're really going to like them.
Here's the interesting part. I don't know the books that Andy has chosen, and he doesn't know the books that I've chosen, and we're sort of going to wonder if we've by any chance chosen one of the same books. So you'll just have to wait, as we will, to that part of the show.
Wouldn't it be funny if we both chose the same books?
That would be scary, actually. So let's see. Maybe let's wait while the listeners at home take a wager on this.
Good idea.
Only kidding. All right, but before we go any further, we'd like you to know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the fine folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Discount Comic Book Service is the perfect place for all of your pre-ordering needs. They have DC, Marvel, Image, Dark Horse, usually 40% off. Other publishers, they have discounts between 20 and 35% off, and sometimes they even have specials, 45 to 50% off the cover price, and often the discounts are more impressive than that. So, Andy, would you like to hear about the bundles for this month?
I would love to hear about the bundles.
All right, well, I have to say that I'm beginning to wonder if Discount Comic Book Service is reading my mind, because this month's DC Bundles offers 50% off on Scooby-Doo.
Oh my gosh.
I kid you not, yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, Scooby-Doo Team Up number 14 and Scooby-Doo Where Are You number 65 for the low price of $2.98. Seriously. And there's also a wonderful Marvel bundle. It's 3 titles: Marvel Universe Ultimate Spider-Man Spider-Verse number 3, Marvel Universe Avengers Assemble Season 2, number 15, and Marvel Universe Guardians of the Galaxy, number 4. And all three of those comics for only $4.47. Again, just really a great savings on some great comics.
You just can't go wrong by shopping with the DCB service. And Gwen, it sounds like they've either been listening to the podcast or they've been reading your mind, maybe a little bit of both.
Or that Scooby-Doo is just everywhere to the ubiquitous comic. I don't know, but I was excited. I will be getting my copies. So
Oh, that's great. Well, and we want to let everybody know that when you do order with DCB service, be sure to tell them that the two people with PhDs sent you.
awesome. So, Andy, do you want to start us off with Monster, or would you like me to?
I will be glad to start us off.
Awesome.
And the first book we're going to be looking at today is Monster by Walter Dean Myers, Guy A. Sims, and Dawood Anyabwile. Again, my apologies if I messed that up. Now, what a lot of listeners may not know, Gwen, is that a young adult book called Monster by Walter Dean Myers came out in 1999 and was a huge book. This book was a National Book Award finalist, a Coretta Scott King honor book, and in 2000 it was the very first recipient of the Michael L. Prince Award, which recognizes the best work written for teens. So this adaptation is an adaptation of a hugely successful and hugely popular book too.
Right, and that's something to take into account, because whenever anyone chooses to adapt an original text that has had such a strong following over such a long period of time, because it's still used in classrooms, my colleagues and I are still teaching it, often in tandem with more contemporary texts, but it still is a relevant book that is being discussed. So whenever someone sets out to do an adaptation of a book like that, you know that they probably felt a certain amount of trepidation and wanted to honor Walter Dean Myers' text. Also, Walter Dean Myers passed away recently, and so it's sort of a fitting tribute, this book, I think, in many ways.
I think so too, and I'm glad to see this adaptation. But I guess we should tell you a little bit about the story. Monster is about a young man named Steve Harmon, and Steve is a teenager, and he's facing prosecution for an armed robbery and murder that happened sometime before. And Steve, of course, as we would expect, this is his book, this is his story, he proclaims his innocence. And we know very early on that Steve is kind of been set up for this, because he's been, as we say in the noir world, he's been fingered as part of this crime. He was, as some of the witnesses say, he was supposed to be a lookout while this armed robbery of this drugstore was going, or convenience store was going on. So what in the actual book, the novel, we have Steve's story as told through a screenplay. Steve wants to be a screenwriter, a Hollywood screenwriter, so he decides he's going to tell his story in script format. And we go through his entire process and everything that Steve is going through, all of his hopes and fears that could be completely shattered by the wrong verdict in this situation. Now, the graphic novel, Gwen, well, I tell you what, do you want to talk about the novel just a little bit before we jump into the graphic novel?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. This novel has been popular in part because of the structure that you alluded to. Classroom teachers enjoy teaching it because, first of all, it's both a first-person narrative in the form of the diary, but then the screenplay is also the kind of text with the sort of layout that encourages reluctant readers to continue reading. So the story itself is very compelling, but educators really love Monster because young people are sort of many young people say that after reading the book that the screenplay drew them in. And it led me to wonder what would happen with this text when it was turned into a visual document, especially because there are actually visuals in the original novel. Walter Dean Myers' son, Christopher Myers, is a children's book author and illustrator in his own right. But in 1999, he was also known, and still is, of course, for his photography. And his father commissioned him to do a series of photos that are in the original text. And there's a photo on the front of the original text of Monster. And I would like to point out to readers, if you've not ever seen the cover, that it's set up like a mugshot. And the protagonist, or the young man whom we are to believe is the protagonist, is looking directly at the camera, as one must do in a mugshot. And I'll just say that significantly in the graphic novel cover, the coloring is the same in terms of the orange background. The young man, Steve's face is prominent, as in the original, but in this instance, the young man, Steve Harmon, is looking almost down and away, which I think in some ways captures the moral ambiguity of the text in a way that that original cover did not. But I just thought I would mention, for readers' interest, if they pick up the original copy, they can see that that there are illustrations, and those illustrations do help to set the mood. So I will also just briefly say that this book has been well received in the children's literature community. Walter Dean Myers himself has always been viewed as an incredibly important and relevant voice. He grew up in Harlem. He had experience in the service during the 1960s. He's led a life that he has then utilized in his text, so that there's a certain authenticity there that is very important. It's extremely important, especially that young people from underrepresented groups get to see themselves in texts. That said, there have been some critical comments made about Monster as well, from individuals who, while they agree that Walter Dean Myers has, very noble intentions, in some ways they argue stereotypes that the larger community may hold about young African American men are in some ways reified, or potentially reified, in this novel. So I just want to point out that, the novel has led to very healthy debate. And I can tell you that when I've taught this text, and I've taught it probably 15 or 20 times over the last decade and a half, it has engendered a lot of really important discussion in the classroom about the depiction of young African American men. And that's why I was so excited when I heard that the graphic novel was coming out, and when I heard who was going to illustrate it, because I was really wondering how they would handle some of those challenges.
Gwen, one of the questions I had too, reading the novel, which I only read a few weeks ago and really enjoyed, was how they were going to translate something that is on paper as a screenplay into a graphic novel. I wondered, are they going to try to translate scene for scene? Are they going to try to just get the intent of what the script was like? I mean, it's almost like you're actually trying to translate a script into a film, except, this is a graphic novel and not a film where the images are sequential, but they are static. So I had some reservations about whether they were going to be able to pull that off.
Yeah, and Sims himself in a recent interview said that he basically said his own background writing scripts for plays and writing comic books himself, because he's co-author with his brother of a very popular independent comic book series called Brother Man, which maybe we can touch on a little bit later. But he said that he'd had a great deal of experience thinking about pacing, thinking about what to leave in, what to leave out. And so it's obvious that what you were thinking as you were reading the novel, Guy Sims was thinking very much as he was writing the script for this comic. And I must say that when I turned to the first page where you see the cast of characters, just as if it's sort of the beginning of it felt more to me like the beginning of like one of those CSI shows or Law and Order. But you get that first image of Steve sort of thinking in his mind of the screenplay rather than seeing it out in print. And I thought that was actually pretty effective. I think it was clear that this was how he was imagining it and sort of writing it in his head.
And, I think that's a very important aspect to the beginning of both the novel and the graphic novel, especially. And when you think about it, Steve wants to be a screenwriter. He wants to be someone who can basically control his own story. And this is a story that he can't control. He's been arrested. He's being tried. I mean, he has absolutely no control other than his testimony over what's going to happen to his life, which, is really completely opposite of what he wants to do with the screenplay, which he does have complete control. In fact, Steve's teacher tells Steve early in the graphic novel, when you make a good film, you leave an impression on the viewers who serve as a kind of jury for your film. And that's exactly what Steve's trying to do. He's trying to construct a movie of this portion of his life that's going to allow a real jury to see that he wasn't connected to this crime that he's being accused of.
Mm-hmm. This is really, it's both the novel and the graphic novel are really about the way that Steve sees himself, his internal life, versus the way he knows he's being seen by others. And in this respect, I would say that both the text originally, but especially the graphic novel, is hearkening back to W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk and his writing on double consciousness. The idea that someone who's a member of an underrepresented group has their inner way of seeing themselves, but they also are compelled to take into account how the majority is looking at them. And this is, so when I thought, when I read Monster, that Myers did an amazing job of conveying it. His prose style especially is such that it encourages the reader to imagine things very clearly. But having it in comic form, to me, brings this point home in a really strong fashion, a really powerful fashion.
Yeah, and Gwen, I don't know about you, but there are, in fact, there are some parts of this graphic novel that I think work better than the novel does. But I think we should also say to young readers that this is somewhat of a challenging graphic novel. It really requires some graphic novel reading muscles. It's straightforward in some ways, but the story moves back and forth quite a bit, and usually those shifts in time and place are unannounced. And some of Steve's movie scenes play out in his mind, and they can be a little confusing if you either aren't already at least a little bit familiar with the book, and especially with how graphic novels work. I think there are some things in there that, if you probably wouldn't pick this up if you're a very first-time graphic novel reader, but it does have a few challenges.
Well, I would, if folks are following along at home or have the book or choose to get the book and come back and listen to the podcast again, I would suggest maybe starting on page 12 and 13 and thinking about one of the techniques that is practiced throughout this comic. This is, after all, a comic that, for the most part, is set in a courtroom. And you have the various attorneys for their clients making the case. You have the judge, you have the jury from time to time. And one of the things that I think is done very effectively, both in the script and in the drawing, is that there are times when when one of the attorneys is speaking and telling the story, and you can tell that the visuals that you're seeing that accompany that story are the visuals that are being either brought to mind by the words used by the attorney, or are actually the images that may even be inside the attorney's mind. So, as an example, on page 12, when the district attorney is talking about Mr. Evans and Mr. King, who are the two gentlemen who actually go into the drugstore in the text and interact with the drugstore owner. She's describing them in a pejorative sense, and honestly, they are drawn looking almost like zombies. They don't look human at all, and since you've already seen them in the courtroom and the way that they are portrayed neutrally, if you will, seeing them in this respect underscores that narrative that the district attorney is sort of putting forward. I think that's the kind of challenge that a young reader will have to work through, or at least maybe upon a second or third read. This is a text for age 13 and up, and I think that that you're right to point out, Andy, that it's beautifully done. Mm-hmm. I think it's an incredibly beautifully drawn graphic novel. But you're right, it does require a certain amount of, as you said, I like the way you put that, comics reading muscles. But I think a lot of kids will feel it's absolutely worth that. That, in fact, I would argue this text could be something of almost a guide to reading comics for young people who are enthralled by the story and are therefore encouraged to make those kind of leaps to fill in the gaps that are left for them. I think it's a challenge, but I don't think it's one that would be difficult to surmount.
No, I don't think it would either. And I think, as you said, this would be a great teaching tool. This would be a great book to use in the classroom, either alongside the novel or independently. The artwork is just incredible. And, when you've got a courtroom stories are really difficult to pull off because normally if it takes any amount of time at all, it's going to be a pacing problem. And how much time you spend in court, the back and forth, the questions, the testimony. It can get tedious, but I never felt like it got tedious in this book. And again, because of some of those techniques that you mentioned, it always keeps it interesting. It always keeps it moving. And again, one of the things that you mentioned too, Gwen, is this idea of identity. Not only Steve's identity, he knows who he is, but he's trying to convince the jury of who he is, that he's not with the same people that committed this act. He's trying to separate himself for that. But also it's interesting, as you pointed out, that the way that we see, not just in this graphic novel, but a lot of times when we see criminals in court versus criminals in doing their thing, as we might say, they look very, very different. And for us to nail down that identity is sometimes difficult.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, when you think about what Myers, his intent for this book, and I feel comfortable saying that because he was very clear during his lifetime about why he wrote this text, what he hoped it would do. He was very concerned about the just incredible statistics of young African-American men being imprisoned. And he was very concerned about young people who want to fit in, who maybe get in with the wrong crowd because they're trying to build up their sense of self-esteem, and then, like Steve, end up in a situation that becomes very dire very quickly. And so Myers wanted to write a text that would in some ways scare young kids who were reading the text, these 12, 13, 14-year-olds who I think he viewed as his intended audience, that it would get them to think about Steve, his decision-making, because we often focus on, when we teach the book, and certainly people who will read this comic will realize they're being encouraged to think about Steve's culpability. But I would argue that there's another level going on there, and that is Myers' desire to communicate directly to young men who are living in areas like Harlem. Although with recent events in the last 4 or 5 years, we could say living anywhere at any time. And we've always been able to say that. But now with the advent of video cameras on phones, we have a far greater understanding of the challenges that young African-American men face nationally, just being in public. But I think Myers wanted to say, look, you do have some control over your associates. And or at least hopefully you do. But it also sets up that larger dilemma for Steve. When you talk about identity, I think he both wants to be a filmmaker and enjoys going to high school, but that high school is in an affluent part of town. His classmates are all primarily from affluent families. He comes home to a neighborhood where there's a lot of community, and you get a sense for that. The person, Mr. Nesbitt, who's a character in the text, who works in the drugstore, is beloved in the community, and it's a close-knit community. But there are some young people who are in gangs and who have no trouble looking at a young man like Steve and taking advantage of his naivete. And so I think that this is a text that Myers really had in mind, talking to that group of young people. And I have to tell you, Andy, that I have a pretty vivid imagination. I've been teaching literature since 1990, and I just really have to take my hat off to Dawood Anya Bahawe. because, and I hope I'm saying his name correctly, because he has just drawn a comic that his choice of style, his choice of color, his choice of panel placement just creates this incredibly oppressive atmosphere in the novel that made me feel truly at a very visceral level Steve's anxiety and his fear.
I agree. It's a very strong graphic novel. It's a very strong story, and both the novel and the adaptation work very well. The only thing, Gwen, that just drove me crazy, and maybe this is because I'm an old reader and I have old eyes, but there's so many times when the different size of lettering was used, and at first I wondered if it was for artistic purposes, but I think it's just the purpose of just trying to get all the text into some really small panels. It was somewhat distracting. I finally got used to it, but for me that was a little bit of a hump to get over. But for young readers with good eyes, no problems.
Yeah, I'd say that's the truth. I have to take that into account whenever I look at a comic. So, but I think this is an amazing accomplishment. I always try to be the sort of person who goes and either sees an adapted film or reads a comics adaptation, and I really try to keep an open mind. But in this instance, because I had taught this text so many times, because I've thought about it so much, I must admit I felt a bit of trepidation, but I can honestly say that the next time I teach Monster, I'll be teaching this version.
That's good to hear.
And I was impressed with the things that Guy Sims chose to leave in. I think that he did an amazing job of, as you said, making the courtroom scenes thrilling. And, the moral ambiguity, I wondered if that would be there. I wondered if I would finish reading the graphic novel and feel the way that I think Myers wanted us to feel at the end of the text-only narrative. And I think he did that. I think that the creative team did that. I felt that same sense, maybe even a little bit more. I will say it was a very moving read.
Well, and we hope that this will find its way into the hands of lots of young readers. And I know that our library is getting, we haven't gotten our copies yet, but we are getting this. And I think, Gwen, we can both strongly recommend this to readers.
Absolutely. And I will simply say that, this book in its print form has been challenged many times. When it first came out for the first couple of years, it was on the banned book list in terms of texts that were frequently challenged. There are mentions of drug use. There are depictions of drug use. There's some very violent language and some actual violence in the text. But I'm of the mind that young people either need to know about this or may already know about it, and they would appreciate, I think, having a truthful account of the situation that Steve goes through rather than something that is sugar-coated. There's a scholar recently who was talking about the dangers of sugar-coating things for children. And I think especially in this day and age, we just can't sugarcoat these issues, like, for instance, the incarceration of young people. So I strongly recommend this text. I think it's going to be one of those books that will be much talked about by critics in the next year.
I think you're right. And you're right that kids can see through sugarcoating instantly. We see that at the library all the time. The kids that want a realistic story, that they'll read something, and if it's sugar coated, they're really not going to have anything to do with it. I mean, their kids are smart, and they know when they're being kind of taken for a ride. They can handle it because, like you said, they see things every day that are just as tough, maybe even tougher than this. So, for parents, I think this is, and this is something we should mention too sometimes, Gwen, is if you're a parent listening to this podcast and you're not sure if this is the right type of thing for your child, again, consider what they're already seeing, and also consider, I don't know, I don't want to say the lesson that's being taught, because this isn't really just a book that's teaching a lesson, but in a way it's a life lesson. And this is an important book. And sure, there may be some things that you as a parent may not be comfortable with, but there's probably going to be enough good that your child gets from it that it's going to be worth it, and it's going to be something memorable.
And there is one other thing that I would point out in that same vein, Andy, before we move on. When this book first came out in 1999, I remember learning about it. This was, remember, before the internets were what they are today. And I remember learning about it because I was in a layover in an airport, and the bookstore at that airport had chosen to put up about 40 of the book covers. As a matter of fact, I'm sure that this was the marketing campaign for the text. 40 of the monster book covers in their windows. So as a person would be walking down the airport corridor, they would look over and they would see these 40 faces of this young African-American man looking out at them in what was obviously a mugshot. And I remember having sort of two reactions simultaneously. One of them was, of course, just interest, because this isn't typically what one sees in an airport. But secondly, a little bit of a revulsion, because when I realized what it was, because then it jogged my memory that the book was coming out, it upset me a little bit for this reason. Our culture has become so inured to stereotypical depictions of young African-American children that while I understand the intent of the cover is to draw you in, to be provocative, in some ways I was concerned that it might reinforce the stereotypes. And when I first taught this novel, I actually was, I've been teaching it since 1999. I taught it first at Cal State Hayward, where the majority of my students were from underrepresented groups. I would say that in my 60-person children's lit intro class, probably 40 or 50 of the students were either African American or were individuals of some, maybe even directly from Africa. This book caused a lot of comment in that class. But then I came and I taught it here at Western Michigan University, where probably only about 8 out of my 20 students were African American. But the book caused a great deal of conversation, and has ever since I've started teaching it, about the issues of both accurate representation of young African-American characters and the dangers of stereotypes. And one of my former students in a class said something really thoughtful that I would like to leave our listeners with, and that is, books are only meaningful in a true sense when enough context is provided. If you're dealing with a young child who perhaps has not had a lot of interaction with individuals from underrepresented groups, just handing this book to that child probably is not particularly helpful without providing the child with some sort of useful context and history. If you do that, then it becomes possible to look at the images in the text and not to view them stereotypically or as stereotypes. Right. And so I think that what I would say is that this is an amazing book. It is doing, I think, some amazing things visually. But I think anyone who's sharing a book with a young person needs to always sort of keep in mind what information they might need that could be useful to them as they're reading that text.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thank you.
And now let's move on to the next book that we're going to be taking a look at, Hereville, How Mirka Caught a Fish by Barry Deutsch. So, Gwen, do you want to tell us about, before you tell us a little bit about this book, do you want to tell us about the two books, other books in the Hereville series?
I'd be honored to. I first heard about this book about when it came out about 3 or 4 years ago. The first one was called Hereville, How Mirka Got Her Sword. And one of the things that I found pretty amazing about it right from the beginning is that it's a text that's set in an Orthodox Jewish community in rural Iowa. And when I heard about the book from a friend of mine whose son had read it, I realized that I needed to read it as well. It sounded extremely exciting. And one of the things that I was able to do was to read up on Barry Deutsch, the author of the series. And it turns out that this was his first graphic novel, and he had entered it originally in a contest that was designed to sort of put forward the importance of having graphic novels with young women as protagonists. And he, as a political cartoonist who had an interest in comics and drawing comics, really felt that there needed to be more comics that featured young women. But he also wanted to feature the Orthodox Jewish community. And he himself was raised as a Reformed Jew, but he had read a number of books on Orthodox communities in the United States, and he felt that this would be an interesting setting, in part because of perceptions that outsiders might have regarding gender roles within the Orthodox Jewish community. I will say that I've enjoyed teaching both Hereville books prior to this one in my classes because, in part, I have students, who perhaps are also unfamiliar with the Orthodox Jewish community, and they tell me after we finish reading the book, and I've given them context and we've talked about background. They've really talked about how this book opened up their minds, made them curious about learning more, and so that's one of the things that I'll say. I really want to commend Barry Deutsch because I think that, as far as I can tell, in all of the reviews that I've read, not just the general children's literature reviews, but reviews, say, in the Forward and other Jewish publications, that this book has been praised for Deutsch's strong, desire to present an authentic picture of contemporary Orthodox Jewish life in the Midwest in rural communities. And so the book, when it initially came out, was met with a lot of fanfare, the first volume, and I was really excited to learn that there would be subsequent volumes. And Deutsch promised at that time that as we moved forward in the series, we would learn more and more about the characters in the text, about their pasts and about their secrets. And I think you'll agree that he definitely delivers in book 3 in that respect. But before I turn it over to you, I'll just give readers a little bit of background so that our conversation will make more sense. So if you have not read Hereville 1, How Mirka Got Her Sword, or Hereville 2, How Mirka Met the Meteorite, basically what you need to know is Mirka is an 11-year-old girl with an incredible imagination, and she is deeply desirous of becoming a sort of, in her mind, a superhero. She wants to fight dragons, and she wants a sword to do that. And in the first volume of the series, she actually does manage to not only get a sword, but she does it in a way that basically introduces magical realism into the series. There are interesting characters, such as a troll who's basically a big giant spider who loves to knit. And there's a witch who lives in a house in the woods near where Mirka is growing up. And probably the strongest character in the series next to Mirka is her stepmother, Fruma. Fruma is an expert at argument. And that's an understatement.
That's an understatement.
I hear you laughing. And in fact, one of the reasons I love Barry Deutsch as an artist so very much is that he uses page layout and he uses elements within panels and he braids them throughout the narrative so that he underscores a point, such as the idea that Fruma has valuable advice to give to Mirka. He does it with page layout rather than directly with words. So, for instance, whenever Fruma and Mirka are having a conversation, Fruma is shown making her points very emphatically, and surrounding her on the page are her speech bubbles, and they sort of push everything else out of the way. And as a reader, you are cued in immediately that Mirka has a lot to say. And what's great is at the end of the first volume, when Mirka does sort of win a contest with a troll, and I think we can say that because if we don't say some of the things about what happens in the past, it's going to be a little bit difficult to figure out what's going on now.
That's true.
But Mirka argues as a way of winning the day. And as she's arguing, she's placed on the page in the exact same figural position as Mirka, as Fruma had been earlier in the text. And her speech bubbles cascade around her just as they did with Fruma when Fruma was arguing with her. And guess what? In the second volume, the same thing happens again. Fruma is shown with her cascading text or speech bubbles, making a point to Mirka. Later, Mirka argues and saves the day, and she does so again with that same figural placement. And it happens in volume 3 too. So just if we can just take a moment to sort of allow me to geek out about this, I love the way that Barry Deutsch handles layout. So just aside from the compelling story, the comic is beautiful to look at, and the layout is incredible. So I will now pass it over to you to let us know what you thought.
I completely agree, and I was telling you off mic that I really liked the first Hereville book, and I like the second one better, and I like the third one even better. I think they grow in strength, and I think we see Deutsch putting into practice what he's learned from the previous book, because each successive book is very, very strong. This third one is my favorite one. And one of the things that you mentioned that is such a good job of layout, as you said, I'm actually looking on page 12, and in the third book, Mirka's siblings, some of them are going on various trips and vacation with Fruma, and Mirka is being left to babysit her sister Lael. And Mirka is very upset because she's saying, "Oh, I can't have any adventures with her. She's only 6." And we see this wonderful, it's in the middle of page 12, and we see Fruma, and we see actually 4 images of her, and they each get a little bit smaller. And the reason they get smaller, it's not because she's getting smaller, but it's because Mirka is focusing more and more on what Fruma is telling her, and she's telling her things about adventures, and Mirka is focusing, and in that last picture of Fruma, she's much smaller, and that's because Mirka she has her complete focus on her. And the way that Deutsch tells that visually is just masterful. And then we get Mirka in the next panel where Fruma has actually put her finger to her lips, saying, showing that that's all I'm going to say about this. And Mirka says, "Don't stop! What things? What adventures?" It's just so beautifully portrayed.
And it's the same braiding too, which is just, it makes me happy. What can I say? It's also interesting because although we didn't plan it this way, because Andy and I try to get to come up with the books that we're going to do before they're released, so that when we're reviewing them, it's very much the books are relevant. They're just out. Hereville Volume 3 just came out last week, so we hadn't had a chance to read these books together before we decided we wanted to do them. Mm-hmm. But it turns out that they're very linked, because both texts are dealing with an individual dealing with culpability. And there's a line on page 11 of the text where Fruma says, Fruma's telling a story. And in the story, a rabbi says to a young man, "Without kindness, justice isn't justice." And that's really the theme of Hereville, How Mirka Caught a Fish, but it provides a wonderful sort of link to Monster as well, because in some ways that you could say that is at least one of the focuses of that book.
Yeah, you really could. I think that's a great parallel to make. And also we talked about Deutsch and the way his books change over the 3 volumes, and how they get stronger storytelling and visually, but also the color. Actually, the first book is not monocolored, but it's a very limited color palette. Mm-hmm. And we see more of that in book 2 and even more of that in book 3. So by the time we get to this third book, it is just really alive with color. And I think part of that maybe subconsciously has to do with the growth that Mirka has experienced in each of these 3 books. She learns something in each book, and she's a stronger protagonist in each book, but visually it's just more amazing as Deutsch progresses through each volume.
Well, probably part of the difference too is that this time Deutsch has more help.
He does. Yes.
You probably looked too at this. The first text, it was all him. Mm-hmm. the second and third, I believe that it was in the second text that he brought Jake Richmond on board for color, although he might have been there in the first text as well. But now he also has someone called Adrian Wallace who's doing backgrounds. Mm-hmm. And I just want to let everyone know that if you're interested in how this comic comes together, there's a Hereville panel that Deutsch has put on his website. All you have to do is Google Hereville, and it'll come up under hereville.com. But he takes the reader through all of the steps that go into just one panel from the comic. And he mentions, as he takes the reader through these various iterations of the panel, who has come on board to help. And so you get a sense for, the way that a comics creator works collaboratively. It's a wonderful teaching moment. It was great for me. I'm definitely going to use it in my classes going forward. But I think it also underscores what you're saying, Andy, about the color and the attention to detail that is in this comic.
Yeah, it really does come through. And, if for those of you who have never tried to do one or tried to draw a comic or produce a comic or a graphic novel, they take an awfully long time, especially if you're doing the drawing, the coloring, the story. So, hats off to Deutsch for not only getting help, but getting really, really good help with these books.
Mm-hmm. And I'll also say that, when we were talking earlier about usually we talk about the age level. This is clearly a middle grade text, I would say, late L, middle school type text. But there's a lot of ways that Deutsch, I think, perhaps because he was a political cartoonist where you have to be so economical and really pay attention to those details within a single panel. But he does a great job in this comic of setting out clues for the reader. You've alluded to color, and in all the texts, color is used to denote changes in scene, which I think for a younger comics reader, I think that's extremely useful. But I will also say that in this particular volume, the magical realism is heightened. And I had to sort of stop every once in a while and regroup. And so it's not that it's not challenging or that a young reader won't learn a lot from reading this comic, but I would say that Deutsch is pretty attuned to the visual literacy needs of a reader who's, say, in 4th or 5th or 6th grade.
Yes, I would say so too. And it does, I think it does get more visually sophisticated throughout each volume. And there's just some wonderful things here. If at the risk of sounding just very simple, if you love a great adventure, you're just going to love these books. But the adventure gets cranked up more, and then, as you said, Gwen, visually it's more interesting, it's more complex. I think the fantasy element in this third book has more depth than the first two. Not that those lack depth, but it's definitely there. But one of the things that I really, really like about this book is that, yes, it's about an Orthodox Jewish girl. You certainly don't have to be Jewish in order to enjoy these stories. In fact, they're so good, and this reminds me of something that Andy and Derek have spoken of in the regular adult version of the comics alternative, referring to the Hernandez brothers and Love and Rockets, which is about a Latina culture. You're involved in these stories, and the same thing with Hereville. You're so involved in the story that you forget that you're reading a story of another culture, because you can identify with these characters so well, and you get the feeling that this character has the same hopes and fears that I have. This character has the same sense of adventure that I have, the same sense of wanting to have fun that I have. Even though this you could call this a cultural book, it's a universal book, and because of that, the culture it isn't the most important thing. I mean, I'm glad that we have this, and I'm glad that this is a book that celebrates the Jewish culture, but you don't have to be Jewish to love this book, and that's one of the great things about this book, and that's one of the great reasons why we need more diversity in our books, and just for that reason alone, I celebrate Hereville.
Yeah, we often, we'll look back to Rudine Sims Bishop's, Bishop Sims Bishops. I'm having one of those days.
It's okay.
Her discussion of mirrors and windows. And while, a lot of scholars will say, well, that's good and well, let's maybe move on to some other ways of looking at it. I still think that that's a pretty important conversation. And I think for young Jewish readers, this is an interesting text because it's possible to see themselves in the text. But I think for young readers who are not Jewish, it is an exciting book, in part because they are actually learning about another culture and in a way that I think Deutsch handles very well. So, for instance, he will move back and forth between Yiddish and English. And there are ways in which he shows in the comic when characters are speaking only English or when they are speaking Yiddish. And what's really exciting is Mirka is, we learn throughout the volumes that Mirka is not super excited about school. Mm-hmm. She views it as an impediment to her adventuring.
Right.
But she does take pride that she gets very good marks in English. And it actually helps her in this particular volume to decipher what's going on because she is competent in English. But I think it's really exciting for young readers to be reading through the comic and to see maybe words that they've never seen before, a language that they've never seen before. And Deutsch is very good about providing the translations right at the bottom of the page. But so it doesn't interrupt the narrative flow at all, but it gives it a feeling of authenticity. Mm-hmm. That I think is really important to the project of the text. One other thing I will say, we always think about dual audience with children's books. And I think there are some nods to people my age and maybe a little bit younger because they go back in time to Fruma's childhood. And I will just say that there are some popular cultural references in there that were very particular to my own childhood, and I really found those to be wonderful and exciting. So there's something in this comic for everyone, I think, in that respect.
I think so too, and I'm really excited about this third book. Now, Gwen, do you know will there be a fourth book?
Oh, I think there's going to be 8.
Oh, wonderful. That's great.
So, and in fact, I think he promises to take Mirka up to her adulthood. At least that was the original plan. Now, I'm not sure. She's still 11 years old in the first 3 volumes. But there's also promise that there will be other family members who will be revealed. And by the way, I just want to scoot back and say it's Rudine Sims Bishop. I knew that, but I messed it up, and I had to look up and make sure because she's a very influential scholar in both children's literature and in education. And her call for windows and mirrors and text is one of the reasons that we need diverse books. And so I want to make sure I was crediting her appropriately. But again, this is a book that just gives you a window on a culture. But like you said, there are many, many young people could look at this and truly see themselves, especially in Mirka, who is not a perfect person and who is perfect among us,
Exactly.
So as I show often. So there we go. I really identify with Mirka.
Well, I really love these books, and you can't go wrong with any of them, and I hope you will explore all 3 of them. Well, Gwen, we've talked about 2 of our books that are new that we want readers to know about. But again, as we said at the opening of the show, there are other books that we won't spend as much time on, but we think that you should be aware of. And so this month, each of us have chosen 2 additional books that we want you to know a little bit about. So Gwen, would you like to go first, or would you like for me to go first?
Oh, why don't you go first? You do the first one, and we'll go back and forth.
Okay, great. My first book is a book that was just released, I believe it was last month, called Oyster War by Ben Tolle, and that's Towle. That comes from Oni Press. Now, it just doesn't get much better than this. Pirates on the Chesapeake Bay in the 19th century. You got pirates, you've got fighting, you've got adventure. But Gwen, this is far from your typical pirate adventure. These pirates are all about disrupting the oyster trade during that period of Maryland history, which actually happened. But they're after something that could give them unlimited power.
Oh.
Yeah. This is a really great adventure, an exciting story with characters that are just filled with life. And it features gorgeous artwork, spectacular coloring, and it's in a large hardcover edition that brings to mind some of those oversized European comics albums.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, kind of like the Tintin, the big Tintin books, not the little shrunk down ones that we typically see, but the really big ones. This is a really, really fun book that I hope lots of people will read. And if you have anybody in your life that loves a good pirate tale, don't hesitate to pick up Oyster War by Ben Toll.
Well, that sounds really exciting, and that's set in your neck of the woods as well. So, I bet a lot of kids in your area will be especially interested in learning about that history.
I hope they are. It's a lot of fun, and I actually had the great pleasure to meet Ben at Small Press Expo, and we talked a little bit about that book. And another book that young readers may have seen of his in the past is Amelia Earhart, This Broad Ocean, which came out a few years ago.
Oh, yes, I remember that.
Yeah, another really, really good book.
Wonderful. Well, if you're keeping track at home and you were betting that Andy and I would have the exact same texts, you're already wrong. I'm sorry. You rip up your ticket and walk away. But that was a good pirate sound, so my first pick is actually a collection of the first 4 volumes of The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl. And this came out, the collection 1 through 4 came out in graphic novel sort of form, compendium form from Marvel last month. And it's written by Ryan North and drawn by Erica Henderson with color by Rico Renzi. And any comic series that opens with a young woman singing to herself to the Spider-Man tune, can she climb up a tree? Yes, she can, easily. It has me sold right on the very first page.
It's a nice rendering, too.
Oh, why, thank you. I'm here all week. Try the veal cutlet. No, okay. I think you'll really love this, and I have to say that that first of all, the person that Ryan North, I guess, has an incredible sense of humor. This is a hysterical comic. Now, it is rated T for teens, and one of the things that's interesting is that the young woman who is Squirrel Girl, she's sort of irreverent and funny, and so the person who plays her buddy and is very serious is actually a squirrel. Called Tippy Top, or T for short. And so it's so interesting because they'll be having these conversations where she's making all these outlandish claims and he's the voice of reason. But it's so weird to have a speech bubble coming out of the mouth of a perfectly realistically rendered squirrel. But this is sort of traditional superhero fare in a way, but in subtle ways, the author, and especially I think the illustrator, are making comments on women and body image in the text. And for instance, one of the things that Squirrel Girl has to hide is a tail. She has this big bushy tail. So as a result, she has sort of a big behind. And, I think in some ways it's handled very well. I was looking at the comic and I'm like, hey, there I am. So when we talk about mirrors, it sort of worked for me. But it's a really sweet comic. There's lots of suspense and adventure. I would put it in the same category as sort of the Scooby-Doo books, except that because of language in some of the situations, it is rated T for teen. And I will say that Discount Comic Book Service does have this right now available for 40% off at only $9.59. So just that added little punch. I really recommend it. It's great. If you like Lumberjanes, if you've liked text like that, I think you'll like The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl. It
sounds like an awful lot of fun, and I was wondering if it would be a good companion book to Lumberjanes, and it sounds like it would be. It's
a reverent and in a really gentle way, and like I said, there's just from the very first page, there's a lot of humor, a lot of jokes throughout the comic. It was a lot of fun to read.
Cool. Well, my second pick is kind of an older book, but it's been reissued for new readers, and that is Astro Boy Omnibus Volume 1 by Osamu Tezuka. And if you've never heard of Tezuka, it's understandable, but Tezuka is as famous in Japan as Walt Disney is in America. And Tezuka's Astro Boy comics have been around for decades. And Astro Boy is actually a robot that's built by a brilliant scientist who's trying to replace his own lost son. But the scientist gives Astro Boy incredible powers to use for good. And Astro Boy is a black and white manga comic that's filled with adventure, robots fighting, aliens, mystery, humor, and it does not feel dated at all. And this black and white artwork is just astounding. And even though this book is over 600 pages, I just breezed through it. I just tore through it, and I'm ready for the next omnibus. It's so much fun. And if you've never read manga before, or maybe you wanted to read it and just didn't know where to start, Astro Boy would be a really, really great place to start. Now, normally this book is $19.99, and on in-stock trades, you can get a 45% off discount, and the book is only $10.99.
Great. That sounds wonderful.
It's a lot of fun.
But if you're playing at home now, and you said that Andy and Gwen will have at least one in common, I'm afraid you too can rip up your ticket. Those of you who thought, no, they're going to have totally different choices, you are this week's winner or this month's winner. My second recommendation is Maris Wick's Human Body Theater. Now, a disclaimer, I've already reviewed this text on another podcast, one I did with Derek on First Second Books and their fall releases. But I love this book so much, and it has stuck with me, that I decided in all honesty, I had to bring it forward again, especially for those listeners who perhaps have only listened to our podcasts. So Maris Wicks is an amazing illustrator, and she's done comics in her own right. And this is a nonfiction text that's suitable for children all the way up through to adults. I would call it all ages, although it's explained that the things that she does in the comic would be completely understandable to younger readers. What she's doing is she has a skeleton who puts on a show, and the show is basically about the parts and components of the human body that come together to form a unified system. And so there are various chapters that deal with things like muscles or the organs or bones, etc. It sounds sort of dry. So let me just say it is a laugh a minute. It is, first of all, she has this way, those sorts of illustrations that are very popular right now, where you might get a T-shirt and it's like a picture of a salt and pepper shaker holding hands and they have little eyes and they're running somewhere, or that sort of unbelievably cute anthropomorphism. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what she does with the human body. So that even when you're reading about excrement, it isn't seriously gross at all. It's fascinating. And just in this, there's a part where she talks about the way that air enters and exits the lungs that I never really fully understood. And she does it. She has these little oxygen molecules holding hands with these little hydrogen molecules and jumping around. And it made, for the first time, I really understood that very well. She alternates between large scale drawings that show how the various parts of a system work together, down to very microscopic drawings of, say, an individual cell. But throughout the entire thing, these parts of the body are putting on a show. There's drama, there's laughter, it's colorful. So it's a nonfiction text, but I'm getting a copy, and I know that I will refer to it often because it actually fills a really important, serious purpose. Young people do need to learn about how their bodies work. That's really an important thing. But on the other hand, it's so fun and so humorous that the quote-unquote lessons really stick with you. And it, too, is available on Discount Comic Book Service for only $10.49, which is 30% off list. So I know we sound like we're advertising here. We're not. We just love these books. And if you want to get a hold of them, they are available right now at really deep discounts, and highly recommend this book.
I remember, Gwen, when you and Derek were talking about this book, and I thought, wow, this really sounds like a lot of fun. And I remember also we had, I did a program a couple of weeks ago for parents about developing lifelong readers, and I spent a good bit of time talking about graphic novels. This is one I wish I had there, because I talked a good bit about how graphic novels can help young readers to understand concepts that might be difficult, or might be difficult if they were just reading it in just regular prose or a regular textbook. When you add those visuals, and it sounds like this would be a great book for that. things a lot of times become much clearer, and it sounds like this is a very entertaining book as well as an educational one.
It is. And, First Second does a lot of books. Like, for instance, they do a number of animal-centered Shakespeare adaptations, which are amazing as well. And again, there you might think, well, that for very young readers, that might be somewhat dry. But the way that the authors and illustrators sort of render the play is just it's respectful of the original, but it makes it relevant for young readers. And I would argue that's what Maris Wicks is doing here with Human Body Theater. It's just really delightful book. But on a more serious note, young people very often do have illnesses or ailments, and this text does a good job of explaining how the body works. Also, what I thought was nice was that many of the examples that are given, for instance, in the chapter on bones, a young person is shown breaking an arm, and then the illustrations show the way that the bones work together to heal. And, those are the sorts of injuries that sometimes young children will have. And so it was interesting to sort of see that she chose her examples very well when she would include sort of a flash over to what happens in real life if you say were to break your arm, or if you have a headache, what's going on inside the brain, that sort of thing.
Wow, that sounds like a great book.
It is.
Well, Gwen, instead of telling our listeners about 2 books, we've actually told them about 6 different books today. So I think our averages are getting a little bit better.
We rock.
Yeah, we do. Well, the 4 books that we just spoke about, not the 2 that we mentioned earlier, Hereville and Monster, those are 2 books that you can't get right now at In-Stock Trades, but the 4 books that we did mention, you can find at In-Stock Trades. And again, you can also go to DCB Service and get huge discounts on a lot of your comic books. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think of these books. You can contact us by going to our website at comicsalternative.com, and on the right hand of your browser, right hand side, you can find a tab that reads Send Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your desktop or mobile device, you can send us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. Or, if you want to contact us the old school way, we're down with that. You can call us on the telephone at 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. Or you can contact us by email. Maybe you've got a comment about the show, or maybe you've got a question. Gwen and I love questions.
We do.
So send us your questions or your comments. You can contact us at 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can get in touch with us individually. I'm Wolverton at comicsalternative.com. And Gwen, how can people contact you?
Well, I am Gwen at comicsalternative.com. You can also find us on Twitter, where we announce our new content to our podcast and updates to our blog. And on Twitter, we are at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, and Pinterest. We even have a YouTube channel.
Woohoo!
Yeah. And one day maybe we should put ourselves on the YouTube channel.
I think we should. I think people are waiting for that. I'm sure. Yeah.
Maybe they can tell us, what they would like to see.
I don't think that's a good idea.
Well, they can tell us. We
have to do it right. Okay.
So you can always access through YouTube if you want to do that. Right now it's just audio based, but give it a shot. You can subscribe through the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn, and you can discover every one of our episodes as well as our reviews and comics-related commentary on our blog at comicsalternative.com.
Hey, Andy.
Yeah.
Before we sign off, maybe we should tell people what we're doing next month.
Ooh, that would be a good teaser. Yeah, why don't you go ahead and tell them?
Well, okay, next month is December, the last month of 2015. And Andy had this great idea that I think is a great idea too, that we would talk about, Andy and I would pick some of our, what we feel to be best comics of 2015 and review those for you. So if you're planning, say, a holiday list of any kind, this would give you the opportunity to have some comics for that stocking stuffer or present.
And Gwen, we could do like we did today with our other picks and not share with the other person until it's time to do the podcast. What do you think?
That sounds like a plan.
And, I think we might actually have some overlap on this one.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. I think that's true, too. But right. You never know. And you'll have to wait till next time to find out.
That's right. You'll have to tune in next time.
Dun, dun, dun.
Well, Gwen, it's as always, it's been a lot of fun talking with you about these books. And, I can't wait till next time when we're going to go over our lists.
Absolutely. Well, have a great month, Andy, and listeners, have a great month as well.
All right. Until next time, I'm Andy.
And I'm Gwen, and keep reading comics.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye.